All right, so you want to get into the head of Plotinus, huh? And coming at it from like a philosopher's perspective.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, great. Let's do it. We're going deep on this one, folks, a deep dive into Neoplatonism. You ready?
Yeah, what's really interesting about Plotinus, especially for those with a philosophy background, is that he's not just like repeating Plato. He's got this whole complex metaphysical system going on. Sure, he's pulling from Plato, but also Aristotle, the Stoics, and even some of those more, less mainstream schools of thought like the
Like
Neo-Pythagoreans.
he's taking all these different philosophical ideas and weaving them into some huge tapestry. I like that. So, okay, Plotinus, he lived and taught in Rome during the 3rd century CE, and we're focusing on his main work, the Enneads. That's a collection of 6 sets of 9 treatises, hence the name, Enneads. So, what's our plan of attack today? Where do we even begin with something like this?
Well, I think we can approach Plotinus's key ideas as like a philosophical climb. We'll
Yeah.
start with the base camp, his view on the sensible world, the world we experience through our senses. Then we'll ascend through his metaphysical hierarchy, the soul, the intellect, and ultimately reach the summit, the peak of his system, the one or the good.
All right, sounds like a plan. But before we even get to that, something's always kind of bugged me about Plotinus. He never actually names his sources directly in the Enneads. It's like he's trying to make us decode a philosophical puzzle.
Right. Yeah, it's true. It definitely makes his work all the more challenging, but also way more rewarding when you start to figure it out. It's like he's asking us to have this big philosophical conversation across time. But we do know from careful analysis that he's going head to head with some big philosophical debates, mainly with Plato and Aristotle, but also with Stoics and Gnostics.
So let's jump into Plotinus's take on this sensible world then. Seems like he kicks things off with this pretty familiar concept, matter and form.
Yeah, at first glance, it might seem like he's just like echoing Aristotle. He talks about matter and form being the building blocks of bodies, but there's this big difference in how he understands matter. Matter for Plotinus is totally formless, completely passive. It's kind of like a blank canvas. Or even better, think of it like a mirror.
A mirror.
Exactly. Matter doesn't actually become the shapes of the forms themselves, but it's more like a surface where those forms get reflected. The mirror itself doesn't change at all, but it reflects those images that are projected onto it.
Okay, yeah, that's a really neat way to think about it. So the forms are like projections onto this blank slate of matter.
Exactly. And these forms, unlike Aristotle's static eidos, are dynamic. Plotinus calls them like formative principles or logoi. Think of them as sets of characteristics that define a body's identity. And here's where we see that Plotinus isn't just like regurgitating Aristotle. For him, these logois aren't like the end-all be-all source of the forms we see in the world around us, the sensible world.
Hold on, wait, you're saying there's even more to this. Where do these logos even come from in the first place?
That's where Plotinus's hardcore Platonist roots really come out. You remember Plato's theory of forms, right? Plotinus buys into those true, intelligible forms that exist in this higher realm, the realm of the intellect, the logoi that shape the sensible world. Those are just reflections or images of these perfect, never-changing forms.
So we've got these perfect forms hanging out in this realm of the intellect and their reflections, the logoi, shaping the world we actually experience. But how does that projection even happen? Like, what's the mechanism?
The soul. The soul's the key here. For Plotinus, the soul is like this go-between, mediating between the intelligible realm, the world of the forms, and then the sensible world. It contemplates the forms, understands their essence, and then projects them onto matter. So the soul is basically shaping the sensible world based on what it sees in the intellect.
So the soul's like some kind of cosmic artist, using the forms for inspiration to create our world.
That's a great way to think about it. And driving this whole creative process is a principle Plotinus calls nature. Basically, it's the cosmic soul's way of organizing the universe, making sure everything has its own place and purpose.
Wait, did you say cosmic soul? Are we talking about multiple souls here?
Yeah, and this is where I can get a little tricky. Got to be careful with Plotinus's concept of the soul. He distinguishes between individual souls, the ones animating our bodies and all, and then this big cosmic soul, the one governing the entire universe. And this isn't just some random collection of souls, no. Plotinus talks about a single hypostasis of soul.
Okay, hold up now. Hypostasis. That's a word that packs a punch in philosophy. What exactly does he mean by that, just for our listener?
Absolutely. Right. So Plotinus uses hypostasis to describe a distinct level of being. We see this term in other places in philosophy and theology too, like in Trinitarian theology, where it's used to describe the 3 persons of the Godhead. For Plotinus, the fact that all souls belong to a single hypostasis means they're fundamentally interconnected, like at their root.
So it's like we're all part of this one huge soul family.
In a way, yeah, it's kind of a cool thought. But super important to remember that each individual soul still keeps its own unique identity. And Plotinus really wrestled with this question. How can souls be individuals if they aren't defined by their connection to a body?
That's a pretty huge question. What's Plotinus's answer?
He argues that each soul has its own unique perspective on that intelligible realm, the realm of forms. So your soul is individuated by the specific way you comprehend and understand the eternal forms, kind of like each soul has its own unique lens to view the intellect in all its forms through.
So it's not just about being part of this bigger soul, but how you as an individual soul engage with these higher realities.
Exactly. That individual engagement is key to how Plotinus sees our place in the big picture of everything. But before we jump ahead to that, let's stick with the individual soul for just another minute. If the soul isn't material, how does it interact with the material body in the first place?
Right. Does it like descend into the body, get all tangled up in the physical world?
Plotinus is super clear on this one. The soul does not descend into the body at all. It stays above, totally untouched by matter. What we experience as embodied life is actually the soul projecting a kind of image of itself onto the body.
So it's like the soul's casting a shadow, and that shadow is what animates the body, what gives it life and the ability to experience the world.
That's actually a really good way to visualize it. Now, here's where things get really interesting. So even though the soul itself stays pure, its image, the one projected onto the body, that gets all tangled up in the experiences of the physical world.
So that's where all the stuff like pleasure and pain, all those messy human emotions come from. They aren't actually happening to the soul directly, but to that image, that shadow it's casting.
Exactly. The soul, you see, in its desire to take care of the body, can get a little too invested in the body's well-being. And because of that, it starts experiencing the ups and downs of physical existence as if they were happening to the soul itself. It's almost like the soul starts to think it is its shadow, mistaking all those temporary sensations and emotions for its real self.
This whole idea of the soul mistaking the shadow for its true self, that's really deep. So for Plotinus, true freedom for the soul comes from breaking free of that identification with the body and all its desires.
Exactly. The goal is for the soul to kind of redirect its attention, shift its focus back to the intellect and those eternal forms. That's where the soul finds true happiness, eudaimonia, in that ascent, back to the source, back to the realm of pure intelligibility.
Okay, I get it. So that's the goal, this ascent back to the source. But how exactly do we, as embodied souls, how do we even start making that climb? How do we shift our attention away from the material world and toward that realm of pure intellect?
Plotinus gives us a kind of map or path, a hierarchy of virtues that guide this ascent. He starts with what he calls the political virtues, and those help us manage our bodily desires and passions. These are the virtues we usually associate with living a good life in society, things like courage, temperance, and justice.
Right, those are like the foundation. But they're just the first step on this journey, right?
Right.
What comes after that?
Above those political virtues, you've got the cathartic virtues. These virtues are all about purification, cleansing the soul from its attachment to the material world and all the stuff that comes with it. Think of them like practices that help us detach from the things that keep us tied to the physical realm.
So practices like meditation, contemplation, maybe even some forms of asceticism?
Exactly. Practices that help us look inward, to focus on the soul itself and its capacity for those higher levels of thought. And as we purify the soul, as we detach from the material, we become ready for the final set of virtues, the theoretical virtues.
These are the virtues that actually get us ready to engage with the intellect and the eternal forms.
Exactly. The theoretical virtues, things like wisdom, understanding, knowledge, they equip us for contemplation, for a direct intellectual understanding of those highest truths. And it's through this contemplation, through this intellectual union with the intellect, that the soul experiences true knowledge, a deep sense of unity, and ultimately even a taste of that blissful union with the One.
The One, the source of all being. The peak of Plotinus's metaphysical mountain. I think we're ready to start that final ascent now, to tackle the most challenging and maybe the most rewarding part of Plotinus's philosophy. But as you said before, this is where things get really mind-bending.
Yeah, it does get intense. Even Plotinus himself admits that the One is ultimately beyond what we can fully grasp. It's so utterly simple, so transcendent, that it basically defies any attempt to capture it with words or thoughts.
I'm getting this feeling of a paradox here. if the one is beyond our thoughts and language, how can we even talk about it? How did Plotinus even approach this seemingly impossible task?
He relied on a method of negation, so he described the one by talking about what it is not. It's a strategy that's used in other mystical traditions too, approaching ultimate reality by a process of elimination.
So like chipping away at all the limitations of our language and concepts to try and get a glimpse, even if it's imperfect, of what lies beyond.
Right. For example, Plotinus argues that since the one is the source of all things, it must logically come before everything else. It can't be dependent on anything for its own existence, and since it's completely simple and totally unified, it can't have any parts or divisions. So that means no word, no attribute, no concept that we can come up with can really be applied to it accurately.
So we're stuck with this frustrating but really interesting situation where we're trying to understand the source of everything, like the very ground of being, and all we can really say is what it is not.
Frustrating, definitely. But it also points to something really profound. This frustration, our inability to grasp the one using our usual ways of thinking, it actually shows us that we're dealing with something that truly transcends our limited human understanding. It's like hitting the limits of thought itself.
Okay, so we can't really think about the one, but can we at least experience it? Does Plotinus offer some way, some method for actually encountering this ultimate source?
He does. And this is where Plotinus's philosophy goes beyond pure metaphysics and into the world of mystical experience. He talks about a kind of mystical union, a direct, experiential contact with the one that goes beyond both language and thought. It's this state of ecstatic bliss, a total merging with the source of all being, a moment where all those divisions between subject and object just dissolve, and the soul experiences its ultimate unity with the one.
So it's not about some abstract conceptual understanding, but a direct, unmediated experience, something kind of like a spiritual awakening, a deep encounter with the divine.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Although, like always with Plotinus, we have to be careful with our language. Remember, the one is beyond all categories, even the category of being itself. So while we might use words like divine or spiritual to try and grasp this experience, Plotinus would probably tell us not to limit the one to any concept like that.
I see what you mean. Even our attempts to label this experience already fall short of what they're trying to describe. So for Plotinus, all this discussion about matter and form, the soul, the intellect, it's all ultimately pointing toward this mystical union with the one.
Exactly. Think of it like this huge philosophical and spiritual journey, a journey back to the source. Every step we take, every concept we wrestle with, every insight we gain, all of it brings us closer to understanding and eventually experiencing this deep, mysterious source of all reality.
It's a really amazing vision, this whole cosmos flowing out of a single transcendent source. But if the one is the source of everything, how can it also be completely separate from, beyond all that it creates? How does Plotinus reconcile this apparent paradox?
That's a question that goes right to the core of Plotinus' system. And it's a question that'll lead us to the very heart of his concept of emanation, a concept that tries to bridge that gap between the one's absolute transcendence and its role as the creative source of everything that exists. But I think we've covered a lot of ground already. Maybe let's take a second to absorb all of this, and then we can dive into Plotinus's answer to this central philosophical challenge.
All right, yeah, I think I've had a minute to sort of let all this sink in. We've gone from the material world up through the soul and intellect, and now we're here at this ultimate mystery. The source of everything, but somehow still beyond it all. It's a lot to take in. So how does Plotinus even resolve this? How can the one be both the origin of all things and yet transcend its creation?
Right, so this is where Plotinus's idea of emanation really comes in, and it's a concept that's really going to push us to think in some pretty counterintuitive ways. Okay, so imagine a spring overflowing with fresh, pure water. That water just flows outwards naturally, effortlessly, without ever actually diminishing the spring itself.
So the spring stays full and doesn't change, even though it's the source of this outward flow.
Exactly. That's how Plotinus pictures the one giving rise to the intellect and then ultimately to the entire cosmos. It's this process of overflowing abundance, this spontaneous outpouring of pure creative energy.
Okay, so we're not talking about creation in the traditional sense, like with a conscious creator who makes a deliberate choice. It's more like an inherent expression, a natural overflow of the one's own perfection.
Yes. And this brings us back to that principle of plenitude that we mentioned before. Remember, Plotinus, drawing from those Neoplatonic ideas, believes that every real possibility has to be actualized. So the one's creative power, its very nature, can't help but manifest itself in all the different forms of being.
So it's not that the one decides to create, but that its existence just necessitates this overflowing, this emanation of everything that is.
Exactly. And this is where Plotinus brings in his idea of the two activities. So the one's primary activity is just being itself, pure and simple, like a state of total unity and perfection. But that perfection naturally leads to a secondary activity, that overflowing emanative energy that creates everything
It's
else.
like a really bright light shining outward, and it illuminates everything around it. The light itself doesn't change at all, but its radiance makes it possible to see, to experience the world.
I like that, a beautiful analogy. And this secondary activity is what gives rise to the intellect. Then the intellect, through its own secondary activity, produces the soul, and so on down the chain of being, each level kind of emanating from the one above it.
So we have this cascade, this continuous emanation, with each level flowing from the one before it. But at the same time, each level also has its own distinct character and level of reality.
Hmm.
And all throughout this whole process, the one stays completely undiminished, totally unchanged by this creative act.
Yes. That's the beauty of Plotinus's system. It manages to bring together these seemingly paradoxical ideas of absolute unity and the multiplicity of being. Everything ultimately comes from the one, but the one is also present within every level of being, kind of drawing everything back toward itself.
And that's where the idea of love comes in, right? This yearning to return to the source, to reunite with the one that's woven into the very fabric of existence.
Exactly. Plotinus sees love as that driving force behind the soul's ascent back to the good. It's what motivates us to turn away from those distractions of the sensible world and seek that union with the intellect. And even the intellect itself, in its contemplation of the one, is driven by this deep love, this desire for total unity.
So it's not just a dry metaphysical system, huh? There's this really deep, almost poetic aspect to Plotinus's thought. Like this idea of the whole cosmos as this expression of love, this grand symphony of being that yearns to go back to its source.
And that's what makes Plotinus so compelling, especially for people coming from a philosophy background. He gives us a system that's both logically rigorous and deeply inspiring. It's a system that speaks to both our intellect and also our yearning for something beyond the limits of the material world.
We've covered a lot of ground today in this deep dive, and I'll admit I'm still grappling with some of these concepts, especially the one.
Yeah.
Such a mind-bending idea.
And that's completely understandable. Even Plotinus himself emphasized that the one goes beyond our ability to fully comprehend it. But the struggle, that's part of the journey too. It's by wrestling with these seemingly paradoxical ideas that we start to expand our understanding of what's even possible, of what could lie beyond those limits of our normal ways of thinking.
And maybe that's the main takeaway from exploring Plotinus, this invitation to embark on this philosophical and spiritual journey, to use our reason and our intuition to try and understand these profound questions, and to develop those virtues that will bring us closer to experiencing that ultimate source, the one, the good, the source of everything.
Exactly. And as you continue thinking about Plotinus's ideas, here's something to consider. If the one really is beyond being, beyond any category or concept, what does that tell us about our understanding of existence itself? What does it mean for our place in this whole grand scheme of emanation? It's something to think about.
Well, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive for today, but it feels in a way like just the beginning of a much bigger exploration. To our listener, I encourage you to take these questions and really make them your own. Delve deeper into the Enneads, explore that huge world of Neoplatonism, and see where your own philosophical journey takes you.